Good morning and welcome to the new Section 3 rule, what you need to know. Before we begin, we'd like to review a few logistics. All attendees are muted and not on camera. Please enter questions via the Q&A box in the toolbar, not via the chat. Questions will be taken at the end of the session. The recording will be available on the Hoover web app and mobile app later today. Discussions in this session are not for media use. Please contact PHADA directly for more information. It's now my pleasure to introduce David Weber, Policy Analyst at PHADA.
Hello. I don't see my picture coming up, although I've stopped the video. Welcome, everyone. Can you guys see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I wonder why I can't see myself. Oh, here we go. There we are. Sorry about that. Good morning and welcome everyone to our new Section 3 rule panel. I am very excited to talk about this today and to welcome our guest, Howard Baum, the Deputy General Counsel of HACLA, the Housing Authority of the City of Los Angeles. He brings over 30 years of experience, 13 years at HACLA. He's a board member of the Housing Development Law Institute. And among his many accomplishments, he did develop and implement the Section 3 guide and plan for the Housing Authority of the City of Los Angeles. Also pleased to welcome Michaela Harris. I'm not sure if I apologize if I've pronounced that incorrectly. She is the Section 3 Compliance Manager at the Rockford Housing Authority in Illinois. She brings over 15 years of service experience and developed the Section 3 plans and programs in Rockford, including their Section 3 Training Institute, Section 3 Resident Portal, and the Life Force Development Institute. Before we get started, I think you go to the next slide. We have a first poll question, just so we know our audience a little bit. In terms of how familiar are you with the new Section 3 rule? Are you very familiar, somewhat familiar, or not at all familiar? So as the numbers come in, it looks like we've got a pretty even split. We'll wait till it finishes and go forward. Looks like a little over half are somewhat familiar. About 40% are, 38% are not at all familiar, and 9% are very familiar. So that fits. We will try to bring everyone up to speed and be helpful for everyone. So I will first go through and review the new rule and what has changed. We will then have Mr. Baum talk about responding to the new rule, what agencies need to do, and then Ms. Harris will talk about actually implementing successful programs and maintaining compliance monitoring during that program. We have only an hour, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. We probably have more slides than we have time to talk, so the slides are available on the app. And so if there's anything that is missed, you can enter a question in the Q&A and we can get to it during the end, or we can, you can look at the other slides that we may have gone over quickly. Next slide. So what is covered, what's changed under the new rule? So as in the past, public housing funding through the Public Housing Program, Section 8 of the Housing Act, and through the Department of Community Planning and Development are covered. RAD also is generally covered, that is, if there's construction as part of the agreement to convert, then the work on that construction is covered generally. It does depend somewhat on the date of your conversion. In a change from the prior rule, Section 8 is no longer covered. Your Section 8 funds are not covered by Section 3, and that would extend to project-based voucher awards. each program does have some separate requirements. So there's one set of requirements for public housing, a different set for community planning and development funding, and there are some different applicability requirements and definitions. So all public housing funding, operating funding, capital funding is subject to the requirements of Section 3. In community planning and development, it's on a per project basis, and I believe the threshold generally is $200,000, and for lead and healthy homes grants, the threshold is $100,000 per project. The definition of a Section 3 worker is largely the same, but they've added this new category of targeted Section 3 workers, and those definitions are slightly different between public housing and community planning and development. In public housing, really any recipient of housing assistance, obviously the residents of the property where the work is being conducted is the highest preference or priority, but then other recipients of assistance, low-income households in the neighborhood, youth build participants, of course. And similar for the community planning and development, it's more focused on income. There is a slightly different transition period reporting requirements. We're focused on public housing, and we'll get to a specific slide on that. But basically the first reporting period for, well, we'll get to that in a minute. And then the other big change is that the oversight of Section 3 is being shifted within HUD from the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity to the program office administering the funds. So if it's public housing funding, then the oversight for Section 3 is going to come from your public housing contacts at HUD in your local office. So that's a big change within HUD, and we're working with them on that. When you're talking about contracts for public housing, all construction contracts and all hiring using the public housing dollars are covered. Materials only contracts are no longer covered. And some professional services contracts are excluded. That is a professional service contract that requires professional certification or degree, advanced degree. So your attorneys, your architects and engineers and such are not subject to Section 3. However, if they are able to provide Section 3 opportunities and labor hours, you can count those without having to count the total labor hours performed. And we'll get into that a little bit more as well. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there's a new metric. Previously, we measured how many hiring opportunities there were and how many of those new hires were Section 3. And for Section 3 businesses, we tracked the contract dollar values awarded to Section 3 businesses compared to the total dollar values. That is now changed to count only the labor hours performed. So you look at the labor hours overall, and then you look at the labor hours performed by the Section 3 workers, and then as a targeted Section 3 worker. And Howard has a great slide on that, but basically, and we'll get into that calculation shortly, but it's all about labor hours, even on Section 3 businesses. You're not tracking, you don't have to look at the dollar values. You now want to look at how many labor hours were performed by the Section 3 business. And with that change, they've also modified the definition. So as well as it being majority ownership by low-income persons or by public or assisted housing residents, if 75% of the labor hours performed by the business in the last 3 months were performed by Section 3 workers, then that business is a Section 3 business, and all hours performed by that business would be considered Section 3 hours. HUD does have a registry for Section 3 businesses, as well as a resident portal. But HUD doesn't verify Section 3 business eligibility. It's still the responsibility of the Housing Authority to have some mechanism, if you think it's needed, to verify that the business claiming to be a Section 3 business is in fact a Section 3 business based on the new definitions. And that is a challenge, and we are working with HUD, and HUD has suggested they'll have some technical assistance on that. And then, as I mentioned, the Section 3 business hours are counted, not the dollar values. Next slide. So when you're looking at your calculations to determine if you're meeting the benchmarks, which I'll cover in the next slide, you look at the total labor hours performed that were paid for by covered funds. So if you're a public housing only agency, that would really be all of your funds, so including your staff time. And then you look at the number of those hours, how many were performed by Section 3 workers, and how many were performed by targeted Section 3 workers. And then you do a simple calculation to divide that to come up with a percentage. Did you reach the safe harbor benchmarks? So then you go to the next slide. And that's all the reporting that is required. Now we'll get to that in a second. So the benchmarks, these are safe harbors that they've established, are 25% of the total labor hours should be performed by Section 3 workers, and 5% should be performed by targeted Section 3 workers. If you achieve these benchmarks, then it is presumed you are in compliance, unless HUD has other reasons to believe you're not in compliance. If you do not reach the benchmarks, or if you're a small PHA with fewer than 250 public housing units, you can then report qualitative reporting. So if you are not a small PHA, you don't reach the benchmarks, you must do the qualitative reporting. For a small PHA, I think that it's a little unclear. I think HUD is assuming that the small PHAs will automatically opt out and do the qualitative reporting, but there could be an option to do the quantitative labor hours reporting and then revert to the qualitative reporting if you don't reach those benchmarks. And you can go to the next slide. And I would mention that not achieving the benchmarks and using the qualitative reporting does not result in an assumption of non-compliance. If you have this qualitative reporting, and this is a draft, what you see on the screen, it's not finalized, but it does appear that the actual reporting will be a simple checkbox list like this to say which activities did you perform. You check that box, you submit it. And then HUD's, the office that's overseeing those funds will look at that, will look at what you're doing and work with you to ensure you're in compliance. Okay, sure I've got all my notes. As I said, there's a sample. If there's other suggestions, we can suggest those. Moving on to the next slide. The timelines, this is one I know a lot of people are concerned about. So I put it in two formats here. Some people like the sort of graphic calendar Gantt chart presentation. Others prefer the little chart that just says if your fiscal year ends on this date, here's when your new reporting period begins and ends. And then your report is actually due 60 days after the end of the first reporting period. So 12/31 fiscal year end agencies, their first reporting period begins on January 1st of 2022. And then after that year is done, they would be required to report. It is important to note that the law is still in effect. So your obligation to make best efforts to achieve Section 3 goals remains. So there's no clear, during this transition period for each HA, depending on your fiscal year end, there's no clear requirement about reporting until that new period ends. But the new rule is in effect. So any contracts issued going forward and your activities starting July 1st for other activities other than contracts really should be in compliance with the new rule to the extent that that is possible. Go to the next slide. So one of the things that we've recommended for folks to take care of during the transition period, for any new contracts that you're entering, any new procurements that you're doing, you really should be including something referencing the new rule in those new contracts, because the new rule was effective as of November 30th, even though you're still in the transition period. For existing contracts, if they will end during the transition period, then you just continue to operate them through the old rule. If they're multi-year contracts that will extend beyond the transition period, then you have to look at the specifics of that contract to see, does it have provisions that automatically update as HUD changes the rule? Do you have the ability to work with that vendor to modify your contract to comply with the new rule, and see what you have to work out. In terms of the reporting, HUD has not been entirely clear. I think that they are still looking for some reporting in SPEARS based on the old rule to the extent that's possible. They've not finalized exactly how the new reporting is going to roll out, whether that's going to be in a modified SPEARS or if it's going to become part of some other online module that they have, such as the, and we're waiting to hear from HUD. But regardless of that, the RAD office, I would mention, has indicated for RAD projects that there is no reporting during the transition period. Of course, RAD, like community planning and development, does their reporting on a project level basis, not on an agency basis. But it's important just to document your efforts, whatever it is that you're doing to achieve Section 3, have some documentation, even if there is no required reporting to HUD, you still have some requirement to meet that. Next slide, please. There are, as I sort of wrap up, there are still some outstanding issues that we are discussing with HUD. And I will say HUD has worked very closely with the industry groups around the implementation of this. We are in regular communication with them. They've had a couple of roundtables on this as we implement. And we've raised these issues with HUD, and they're trying to work through them. So here are the outstanding issues that we've identified. One is agencies that utilize a central office cost center, and this could apply as well to some of the MTW agencies. Are the positions supported by the central office cost center subject to Section 3? We would argue they are not. Once fees are paid to the COCC, they at some level are theoretically non-federalized. And so Section 3 probably would not apply. If you are using an allocation plan, then you can divide the labor hours by that same allocation formula. But if you're using a fee-based, we are going to need some guidance, and there'd be some more discussion on that, and we'd like some clarification. HUD has also not been clear about what criteria or guidelines will be used to determine compliance or what the penalties might be for non-compliance. I think they're really looking for a partnership to try to make this as effective as possible wherever they can, and trying to refocus on a outcomes focus rather than a compliance focus. One of the big issues that folks are going to have to work through is about what procurement and hiring process modifications, if any, can they use to implement the suggested preferences or priorities under the Section 3 rule. As I think you all know, procurement requirements, there are federal requirements, but there are also often state and local requirements, and the stricter requirement applies. Similarly, in hiring, there are a lot of state and local regulations, so you have to be careful. We have also we have asked HUD for recommended new contract language, and they are working on that, but have not provided it. Unlike the old rule, they're not dictating what contract language you need to have. And then I think they've tried to address this in the rule, but I think some additional clarification is needed when there are both public housing and community planning and development funds in the same project. in terms of how do we make sure those numbers are reported accurately, don't end up being double counted, and we have the right timeframes. So that's my quick run through of this. And as we get, before I turn it over to Howard, we'll ask a second poll question, which is, what is the status of your Section 3 program policy? Do you have a formal policy that was adopted by your board? Do you have a program and a policy, but it was not formally adopted? It's just an operational document? Or do you actually have no written program policy or plan at all? All right, so thank you all for responding. All right, so it looks like about 36% do have a formally adopted policy. About 25% do have a written policy, but nothing approved by the board. And 26% don't have any written program policy. So there's definitely some areas that we HUD and our agencies can work on to improve those policies and also to develop those policies where they don't exist. So with that, I will now turn it over to Mr. Howard Baum to give his perspective on the new rule and things housing authorities should look for. Thank you.
Well, greetings from Los Angeles. Can all of you see me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So if we, I'm Howard Baum. I'm Deputy General Counsel for the Housing Authority of the City of Los Angeles. We have been running a fairly successful Section 3 program here for the last 7-8 years. Kind of sad to see it go, but excited about maybe some of the changes and new ways we can continue to make Section 3 successful. So why don't we go ahead and turn to the next slide here, get started. As David mentioned, PHAs are required to revise their processes, their systems, their documents, et cetera, to comply with the new rule on or before July 1st. So that is right around the corner. So I saw in the survey that about half of our attendees are not familiar with the new rule yet. So hopefully at the conclusion of this presentation, you'll have a bit more information and can get started on those efforts. I think one of the key things to remember here is that each housing authority's response is really gonna vary depending upon its Section 3 program. The polling we just did showed that roughly 60% of you have either a formal or informal Section 3 program. And so for those of you who have such programs, you're certainly going to want to amend those to align with the new rules. In our case, we actually have to supersede and replace ours almost in its entirety based on the new rule. Really depends on your agency. And if you do not have a policy, this might be the time to think about adopting one either formally or informally. One of the other things to think about here is whether or not you need to amend your procurement policy. Now, some of you may recall that under former Part 135, housing authorities were authorized to adopt bid preferences for Section 3 businesses up to 10% of a bid amount, meaning that if they bid within 10% or that lower amount as the contracting dollar value went up, you could give that contract to them. Otherwise, for an IFB, for example, under Part 200, it would normally go to the lowest responsible bidder, and generally state law aligns with that. So you were liberated in some ways and were able to give that preference that you are no longer authorized to provide. So you should be looking at your procurement policy or wherever else you might house that kind of preference if you have one, because you'll need to remove it. One of the other changes that we've seen is that contracting goals, Section 3 business contracting goals are now no longer in effect. So you may remember that 10% of all construction contracts and 3% of professional services agreements should have been awarded to Section 3 businesses. With the elimination of that goal, that requirement is no longer here, but you may have memorialized that somewhere, perhaps in your procurement policy, perhaps in some of your contracting forms with some contracting goals, et cetera. So it's something to be aware of, to look for. Again, it will differ depending on on how your housing authority is set up and how you administer your policies, but that is something I would be looking at. But regardless, and this is really for the other 50% of you, so to speak, regardless of whether you have any of the things that I just talked about, it's going to be really important that you amend your contracting forms and solicitations. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. All right. So new part, subpart 7517 provides in part that PHAs must include language in any agreement or contract to apply Section 3 to contractors. That's pretty clear. But as David mentioned earlier, HUD has not come out with any kind of uniform or boilerplate language, and PHAs are really left to their own devices to figure out what they want to include. So the following are my recommendations. As I've said to some others, when I was in school, this is what the teacher or professor said, this is on the exam. This is the stuff you should pay attention to. So I hope you'll do that either by writing it down now or looking at the presentation later. These are the things that I think are really critical to include in your contracting forms, whether that's embedded in the actual contract, if it's an attachment like the general conditions may be, whatever you choose to do. There's no right or wrong approach here, but you certainly want to have this language. The first thing is, you probably want to identify what those new benchmarks are, right? The 25% of Section 3 worker and 5% of targeted Section 3 worker benchmarks. As David mentioned, those are goals that are imposed upon us. And in turn, we want to impose those upon our vendors. So definitely want to include that. You certainly want to also include the new definition of a Section 3 business concern, a Section 3 worker, a targeted Section 3 worker. Those definitions, I've identified the subparts there, 75.5, 75.11, and 75.21. If you're going to be asking a business to complete a certification that they are in fact a Section 3 business, or ask their employees to do so, then you certainly want to have the definitions in there so they understand what that means exactly. And we're gonna spend a little more time on that in a couple of minutes here. Employment and training and hiring priorities and subcontracting requirements, all of the things that you'll find embedded in 75.9, which would be expectations of compliance that we would impose on our vendors, our contractors, should be included. So I would definitely include language there. I would not take the language verbatim. I think that what's true of all of these regulations is that they include a lot of language, but I think it's pretty easy to key in on what's important in a very short period of time. So there are portions of each that I think are relevant and should be included here. We talked about the new labor hour benchmarks. Well, you certainly want to include language about the labor hour reporting requirements, as well as qualitative efforts that might be made. So in some instances, a contractor may be committed to doing something and for whatever reason is not able to meet that. You want to understand what those qualitative efforts were. What was the outreach? How did they try to comply with the new Section 3 rule? And that, again, take a look at 75.15, because that's where you're going to find that information. Documenting compliance, record keeping, the certifications, again, all really important, right? We have to keep our records. We have to document them. We're going to need certifications with respect to whether folks met those definitions of eligibility. So again, take a look at 75.31. That's where you're going to find, I think, the key language that you're going to want to include. And something that may have escaped the attention of many folks here, and this is going to be one of the catch-up items, is we all have our maybe-weeby language that are included in our contracts. Well, they currently refer to Part 135. So don't wait for HUD. Go ahead and change the reference to Part 75. It's time to go ahead and do that. While we're on the slide, I will also make mention, as David said, that our PBV contracts, I'm not talking RAD now, I'm talking about traditional PBV contracts, are no longer subject to Section 3. Well, if you look at the AHAPs and the HAPs, they include Section 3 language. We have been advised by HUD that you can go ahead and just strike that language out. Normally, you don't want to amend those forms, but we've been told you can do so in those instances because Section 3 will no longer apply to those particular contracts. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so what are some of the other changes that need to be made? Well, let's talk about the Section 3 business concern certification. And what I'm going to actually do here, recognizing that about half of you are not familiar with Section 3 yet, let's go to the next slide for just a moment. So let's see, the Section 3 business concern. Well, the definition's changed a little bit here. A business concern meeting at least one of the following criteria. Now, this is key. Documented within the last 6-month period. And here you can see what it is. At least 51% owned and controlled by low or very low income persons. Over 75% of the labor hours performed for the business over the 3-month period are performed by Section 3 workers. So that's a pretty dynamic one, right? That's the period just before the contracting period, that 3-month period beforehand. And then the third is at least 51% are owned and controlled by current public housing residents or residents who may currently live in Section 8 assisted housing. That is certainly new. That's Section 8 assisted housing. But if you look at the top, I underlined within the last 6 months. So that's a pretty dynamic situation. So let's go ahead and go back to the last slide. So the first thing that occurs to me here is that you're going to want to update, if you maintain a Section 3 business registry, which you'll see is the second item I have here, you're going to want to do a couple of things. One, you're going to want to update your certification form to say that they meet, a Section 3 business concern eligibility by virtue of one of those 3 ways. Number 2, you're going to probably want to update your Section 3 registry, and keep in mind here that if you've used the HUD registry as well, as David mentioned, that is a list, but it really, by definition, there is no one that certification is good beyond 6 months. At the outset, it's at 6 months. Now, the reality is ownership's probably not going to change, but I'm going to recommend as a best practice that every time you contract that you have them do a new certification form, that they meet eligibility again by virtue of one of those 3 ways. So you're going to need updated Section 3 business certification forms. If you are maintaining a Section 3 business registry, you're going to want to go ahead and update and refresh that registry. If you're using the HUD registry, just keep in mind that you're going to want to, of course, ask for current certifications. I've not heard from HUD any efforts on their part to update their registry yet. Create Section 3 worker, targeted Section 3 worker certification forms. Now, we've been told by HUD that forms are forthcoming. We've yet to see them. And in the meantime, what are you supposed to do? You are supposed to be operating under the new rule right now, as David mentioned. And there's a little note here. There has been an issue about folks qualifying. So under the definition of a Section 3 worker, and let's go ahead, I tell you what, let's go ahead and do this. If we can move up 2 slides to the slide that, there we go, Section 3 worker defined. So for a Section 3 worker, take a look at the left here. A worker who currently fits or when hired within the past 5 years fit at least one of the following categories as documented. The worker's income for the previous or annualized calendar year is below the income limit established by HUD. The worker is employed by a Section 3 business concern, or the worker is a youth build participant. So folks could have qualified based on any one of those definitions. And by the way, now remember, it is the Section 3 worker's individual, not household income. That is a big change. You used to look at the household size. You can see the income table here that we use in LA, where we would normally, if it was a family of 4, we would look at that 94,600, and that would be our benchmark. Where today it is always going to be on that individual. I know there's sticker shock when you see those numbers. Welcome to the cost of living in Los Angeles. It gives you some indication of what things look like today. But that 66,250 is the only number we're ever going to look at now. It doesn't matter if that's a family of 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. That is the only thing we're going to look at. And now we are very focused on that individual income. So let's go back a couple slides here. Okay, perfect. So under my third item here, where I said there's been an issue or a concern raised that if you are asking somebody to certify their income or to certify eligibility based on income, that you're inquiring into income, which is in fact not authorized in some states. And so my suggestion to you is simply to have a certification form, and perhaps we'll see this on the future HUD form, but if not, create one of your own that simply says, I meet Section 3, I meet eligibility as a Section 3 worker or a targeted Section 3 worker by virtue of of one of the following and have them sign. So they're not defining how they meet it, they're just meeting it. And that takes that issue off the table for you. And perhaps HUD's own forms will make that a little easier to follow. By the way, I do see there's some questions here. We will come back and answer all questions raised. Please keep an eye on the slides, the title of those slides. So if we need to go back to those, we can help you. It might make things a little bit easier here. The next item, update Section 3 worker registry. Well, again, if you, and I think Michaela is going to talk a little bit more about this, you may now find that more folks actually meet the definition of a Section 3 worker or a targeted Section 3 worker. So again, you know, if you go ahead and I think I would be advisable to make sure that that registry is current, that folks in that registry you know, have a current certification form and may expand opportunities to identify other eligible targeted Section 3 workers. Next item, update other contracting forms, provisions, bid solicitations, and exhibits. Well, what am I talking about there? Any reference to the old rule and Part 135 needs to be updated, and any reference to the old definitions certainly needs to be updated. So this is something that you want to keep in mind. David mentioned the reporting form. So HUD Spears 6002 form, as you may know, the old form actually had a column for hours worked, but that was not a required column. We understand that there is an updated Spears, form coming, so we'll have to see what that looks like. But since we don't have that, I would suggest that you're reporting right now. If you're going to ask, vendors to start reporting as of now, then at the very least, you kind of look at that form as a point of reference so that you're collecting data in a way that aligns with the form and with the new expectations. Okay, next item, implement new rule in all new solicitations. So this caught me off guard. We have a new RFP on the street, and I realized that the award date, by the time this one goes to our board, et cetera, will be after July 1st. And regardless of that, it still is subject to the new rule. So we just issued an addendum yesterday, superseding and replacing some of our old contracting language. This one had been in the works for a while, had the old Section 3 language. We usually put our contracts out there to say, this is the contract form under which we're going to operate. And so we had to do an update. So that's something to keep an eye on. It said I'm kind of familiar with Section 3 and it even caught me. So please do that. Next item, identifying. Yes.
1 minute warning.
Oh, thank you. Okay, I'm going to race. Identify existing contracts affected by the new rules. So you heard David mention, consider your multi-year contracts and whether they should be amended. I'll give you two reasons why. Number one, you may want to capture the labor hours if these are professional services agreements that had advanced degrees and might no longer be subject to Section 3. You may want to capture those hours to help with meeting your benchmarks. Another thing is you may want to align with the new rules. So, it's confusing to have different definitions out there. So I'd encourage you to make sure you do that. If you have redevelopment agreements or master development agreements that contemplate, being effectuated over several years under DDAs, for example, you're definitely going to want to align those with the new rules. And the final point here is education. You got a lot of stakeholders out there. So you need to have a plan to educate your existing stakeholders on what these changes are. Those might be staff, they might be vendors, they might be external stakeholders, certainly your board. Think about however you promote Section 3 in letters, publications, website, you're going to want to update those things. So I think what we'll do is this, I want to stay within our time constraints. So why don't we bring up our next poll question? Oh, Sarah, can...
One moment, I'm just launching now.
Yeah, so for your Section 3 program, do you have one or more full-time equivalent FTE dedicated, less than one FTE dedicated staff, no dedicated staff time, or not applicable? Okay, so it looks like 31% of you have one or more full-time FTE dedicated. 32% of you have less than one FTE dedicated. Majority answer. 25% of you, no dedicated staff time. And we have not applicable to 12% of you. And I would just offer this observation, which many of you, of course, have recognized on your own, that Section 3 requires a lot of time to administer. And unfortunately, there are no admin fees that come with a Section 3 program. So you've got to be creative in how you manage that. But it does require active management to be successful. You're going to hear more about that momentarily from Michaela. So it is something that you definitely should be considering. At this point, let me go ahead and turn it over to Michaela Harris, again, who is the Section 3 Compliance Manager for the Rockford Housing Authority. Thank you, Michaela.
Thank you, Howard. Good morning. One of the things that I struggled with when I first took on this role at my agency was how to take a words on a page and implement them into a real world program that addresses the barriers that our residents are currently facing. In the next couple of slides, I will share some of the things that we have implemented at our agency that have helped us to become successful. One of the most important things that you can do is build partnerships. If for some reason you don't meet your benchmarks in your next reporting period, you're going to have to talk about your qualitative efforts, the things that you have done as an agency to try to meet the benchmarks. And one of those things are partnerships. Some of the partnerships that I would encourage you to start building, if you haven't already created them, are with your local youth build. Youth builds exist across the country, so if you have one in your community, I would recommend that you establish a partnership with them. It's a win-win. You can refer your residents to their programming. They can refer their participants for jobs with your contractors. That's going to go a long way in you meeting the benchmark for the targeted Section 3. There may be other programs in your area that are pre-apprenticeship style programs or apprenticeships. So I would encourage you to make those connections as well. In Rockford, we have one, the Awakening Foundation, that just got it approved through the city. They're starting an apprenticeship program for the culinary arts. It's a free program to low-income individuals. And that's a MOU that we already have established, and we are working with that foundation. So again, make sure that you're building partnerships with those types of agencies. Another partnership you can build are with your social service agencies. Individuals who receive TANF or SNAP, sometimes they have to, if they're not exempt, they have to do community service or participate in training or education programs. We have a social service agency here in Rockford that we've established an MOU with, Northwest Community Center, and they refer their clients to our programming, their Section 3 residents, so that helps us. And they also, we can refer our clients to some of their programming as well. So reach out to your social service agencies. Public relations. That might seem a little different to reach out to those, but in Rockford, we actually have one called Project First Rate that fosters positive relationships between the trades and the craftsmen. We have partnered with them several times in hosting events for how to do business with the PHA. We've taken youth or interested residents through their training facilities to learn about apprenticeship programs and all of that. And Project First Rate has been a fantastic partner in helping us connect our residents with opportunities in the trades. So if you have firms like that in your community, reach out to them. They could be very beneficial to you and your residents. And then ultimately your own resident services team. If you're like me, you might be a one-person department at your agency, so you might not have a team. You want to make sure that you are partnering with your resident services team. A lot of what your resident services department is doing are going to be those qualitative efforts, the education, the training, the case management, all of those types of things. So make sure that you have a solid partnership with your own resident services team. Next slide, please. Programs and initiatives. These are some of the things that we've done at our own housing authority that have helped us meet our goals. Resident assessments. This is a very easy one. Every at move-in and at annual recertification, our residents complete an assessment. It's a 2.5-page assessment. It addresses the fields that they're interested in, what kind of trades or whatever the case may be. Also, it addresses their barriers. And annually, I'm able to pull up and see how many people need a GED or feel that a GED is a barrier to them gaining employment, or not having a vehicle, reliable transportation, childcare, all of those types of issues. And it helps us to address the current barriers that our residents are facing and structure our programming around that. Section 3 portal is another thing that we have created. It's an online portal at our website that residents can go in and self-certify as a Section 3 resident. Once they're registered in the portal, they get an email alert for every single job, employment, and training opportunity that comes across my desk. So it's mandatory that all PHA jobs and all contractor jobs are posted in this portal. Well, a lot of our community partners, they ask us to post their jobs in there as well. We have some businesses. I've posted jobs in there for local restaurants that are looking to hire individuals. Plus, our community college has sent us things to post for opportunities, and then any training or education program as well will go in there. Training programs. This is huge. We offer 2 different types of training programs at our agency. We have an on-the-job training program, and then we have a classroom style. So our Section 3 training program is an 8-week on-the-job training, and they train at our PHA in various departments. By the time they complete the 8-week training, they should be qualified for an entry-level position in that department. They receive a certification and a letter of recommendation from the agency upon successful completion. Another program is our Life Force Development Institute that focuses on all the soft skills that residents need to gain employment. One of the things that we learned when we were talking to employers in the area was that attitude and attendance are the #1 issues with new employees. We address that right off the bat. We also talk about motivation, setting goals, how to achieve those goals, and ultimately even how to interview and how to craft a resume. We talk about financial wellness in that as well. So it's an all-encompassing course that addresses many of the qualitative efforts in the new role. And then finally, your public events. You know, the touring those training facilities that I mentioned, the how to do business with the PHA, education style events, women of influence. A little factoid for you is that over 70% of public housing households has a female as the head of the home. When I learned that, I realized that's my Section 3 audience. I need to create events that target that audience. So that was a very successful event that we had. Next slide, please. And then, of course, compliance, our favorite part of Section 3 is how do we monitor compliance? The things that we do at our agency are those compliance forms. Howard talked a lot about that. Resident forms self-certifying that they are Section 3. Both your residents and your contractors are going to need certification forms. And it's very important that you review this with your legal team to make sure that you're not violating any state or local laws, and that you're in compliance with all of that when you're drafting these forms. Opportunity notices. Every employment, training, and education opportunity should be posted for your residents to view. We post at all of our developments. We post at our central office. We also post in our resident services department. That Section 3 portal that I mentioned is very vital to us getting those notices out to our residents. I would highly recommend that you have a digital way to reach your residents, even if it's just doing the assessment, taking the emails from the assessment, putting them into a database, and then emailing that database every time you have an employment or education opportunity. That's going to be a huge qualitative effort. It's also going to help you increase your compliance. Anytime I create a notice, for my contractors, I always send them a copy of the opportunity notice so that they have one for their file as well. Procedure lists. I developed procedure lists or guidelines for the contractors to follow if they need to hire somebody, how to certify Section 3, all of that. it's been really helpful for the contractors to have a clear-cut guideline on what they need to do and how they need to do it. That's going to, again, help you to increase your compliance. And then finally, our compliance notices. At some point, an agency is going to have a contractor that has violated Section 3. You want to make sure that you have developed a tiered approach to compliance violations, whether it's a level 1, level 2, level 3, or however you decide to implement it in your agency. But that you should have that clearly documented in your policy and follow those guidelines every single time you have a contractor that violates Section 3, and that they know what those level of violations are that could lead up to being sanctioned and then not being allowed to do business on any HUD funded contracts. So make sure that you have that type of an approach. I would say that it would be very beneficial. And then always keep a copy of any of those notices given in the contractor file, just in case. So that concludes my presentation. I hope that you learn some things, maybe some ways that you are able to implement Section 3, add to your programming, or even start some programming for your agency.
All right, thank you so much. I hope everyone has gotten good information out of that. Before I do want to mention a couple things before we get into the questions that we have in our remaining 9 minutes. One is that the two forms on my slides that showed the blanks to fill in the labor hours and then the checklist, the draft checklist of qualitative efforts, those actually are from the proposed notice of information collection for Section 3 that HUD had published. So we did submit a few comments on that, but that is what it appears the Spears form will be. I also do want to mention that I do think that this has been a good faith effort on the part of HUD to try to find a way to improve the rule to get better outcomes, with the focus on labor hours being designed to create more long-term opportunities. And along those lines, we did have a question that says, well, let me go. I'm going to take these in order. We have a couple of requests for copies of the certification forms, of the former policies, and even of resident assessments. And I think we will try to make those available. I would mention one of our sponsors, Designing Success, does offer case management tracking and a lot of related services. Let's see. We have a question whether insurance contracts are not covered, such as health insurance, workers' comp, liability. And I'm going to say, yes, I think those would not be covered by Section 3. Howard, do you have anything to add on that? HUD hasn't specifically identified those at this time, but.
David, I would agree with that. Understand that, the intention of Section 3 is where you are entering into an agreement that is essentially fee for services. In other words, there's a labor component involved. You're going to ask someone to provide some form of services to you where there's labor. That is where Section 3 has traditionally been triggered, and we can see now where it's construction focused. I don't see insurance falling into that vein. Having a broker or an agent secure insurance for you, or even dealing directly with an insurance company, you're really not asking them to provide labor hours. So my view is that insurance would be excluded. We have never applied it to insurance agreements.
And then we have a question: how does Rockford Housing Authority fund all of their Section 3 implementation efforts, the portal, the training programs, et cetera?
Well, some ways that we do with the training program is that we have a ROS grant, so our ROS coordinator can help teach in some of those things. The Section 3 training program, I take care of any the small amount of classroom training that's associated with that and the onboarding. And then they just train with our current staff in different departments. So it's actually pretty low cost when it comes to that. The resident assessment is essentially the cost of the paper. So there's ways to do it without having to spend a lot of money. I would say the most expensive thing we have done is the implementation of the portal and the fees that were associated with getting that up and running.
Sorry. And I guess the last two questions, well, if we have any, so if here's a question, if 3 years ago we hired a targeted Section 3 worker and he or she qualified under the income guidelines at the time of hire, can this worker's hours be counted for the next 2 years, even if on July 1st, 2021, the income of this worker is above the income guidelines?
Yeah.
Howard, you want to take that one?
Sure. Michaela, I'm going to ask you to jump in and join me here if you feel my answer is not quite satisfactory. First of all, so let's go back a few years. We didn't, remember, we took the definition Section 3 resident and we bifurcated that into a targeted Section 3 worker and a Section 3 worker. So we didn't have a targeted Section 3 worker definition necessary 3 years ago. What we did have is income qualified. And one of the issues that HUD has communicated concerns with is you could have an individual who at the time that they were hired actually met income eligibility and performed well, secured raises, and subsequently no longer met eligibility requirements. And so the new rule is that there's a very conscious effort to recognize that situation. And so if you look at the definition of a Section 3 worker, not a targeted Section 3 worker, it says they are income qualified within the last 5 years, meaning that you would capture that individual in that definition. Now, if they qualified, for example, because they lived in public housing or Section 8 assisted housing, their income would be irrelevant, right? And so they would meet eligibility as a targeted Section 3 worker that way. So just to be clear, in your instance, if they don't live in public housing, if they were just income qualified, they're still going to meet the definition of a Section 3 worker. But if they happen to live in public housing or Section 8 assisted housing, they will meet the definition of a targeted. So I think I've got that. Michaela, anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with your thoughts on that. I mean, the rule clearly states at time of hire or currently meets. So I think, you know, if at time of hire they qualified as Section 3, you can count them for the entire 5 years, regardless of how many pay increases. Because the purpose of the new rule is that we're not just constantly hiring new Section 3 people for temporary work or things like that for short-term contracts. They want people to be successfully long-term employed. So I think that that's the purpose behind that language.
Right. And everybody should understand, it's not about head counts anymore. It's about sustained employment. And so the incentive here is to make sure that people get work and stay employed. That's what we're after here.
Right. So we'll take a last question and then have some quick closing comments. Last question, does a temp agency fall under Section 3? My initial response would be probably yes, depending a little bit on what the temp workers are doing. But normally I would think those labor hours would be counted if they're funded by covered funds. Howard or Michaela, you have anything to add on that? Or
Michaela, you want to take or
you agree?
I'll let Howard take this one.
All right. It really depends on what that temp agency is doing for you, right? I guess that's not clear to me. If you said that they are going to be providing, you know, if they're going to help us identify temporary workers, their work is actually identifying temporary workers. That's the work they're doing for you. It isn't to say, and so the other question would be, does that work require an advanced degree or certification, right? Because now professional services, so this is a key that isn't talked about a lot, but professional service agreements where an advanced degree is required or certification are no longer subject to Section 3. Now you might be able to make the argument, well, there's no advanced degree required and therefore it does apply in those instances or potentially applies. I would just say, you may ask them to provide, you know, I suppose it doesn't hurt to say, look, We would ask that when you are identifying temporary hires, that our preference would be that they're folks who meet these parameters. I suppose you could do that. Again, it's really situation specific. That one's kind of a little wonky. That's why Michaela didn't want to answer that and send it to me. See, it's a little strange, but
Yeah.
no, it really is. It's a little strange. So it would just really depend. I mean, I guess the best practice I would say is we would really like to work with people who are low income or live in some kind of assisted housing. And so if you can send those, that would be our preference.
Right. All right. As we hit our end time, do either of you have some final comments you want to make before, just for 30 seconds before we close out? Because I do.
Well, I will touch on one issue that I think is kind of interesting here, or a couple, just for folks to think about. Now that we're moving to individual income versus household income, as I brought up earlier, we don't really know what the implications of that are yet. We don't know if that's going to help or hurt our program. And that's something that I think we all should just keep an eye on. And if we do find that it is creating, it may, again, make for a better program, it may not. So I think I would watch for that and voice your concerns should concerns arise. The other thing I would say very quickly here is, and we talked about it, because you can satisfy, it's very important to understand that you could satisfy Section 3 requirements by virtue of your workforce's existing makeup, meaning that if existing is 25%, right, Section 3 worker, and 5% is targeted, your existing workforce can satisfy that. That may mean that a contractor isn't creating new employment opportunities. And so it depends what lens you look at this through. Some housing authorities will be relieved to hear that and say, great, that means we can do less work because our contractors will be able to certify more folks, and so we will meet our benchmarks. Other housing authorities look through it the lens of, we want employment opportunities created for our Section 3 residents, and may view that as not a good thing because contractors will be able to say we already satisfy it by virtue of our existing workforce. Just keep those things in mind. And the last very quick point is, because it's based on project hours, keep in mind that most contracts will straddle your fiscal year. So you're going to have to monitor a little more carefully to capture only those hours within your fiscal year. So if that contract, again, straddles, 2 fiscal years for you, you have to keep an eye on that. So I'll stop there.
And just touching on what Howard said, I think about the creating new employment, if contractors are able to meet that requirement with their existing staff, that's where your programming, your training, and all of your partnerships are going to come into play, because you're able to connect your residents with other opportunities outside your agency. It doesn't just stop with employing people at your housing authority or with your contractors. Ultimately, we have a duty to help our clients receive employment regardless of whether it's with us or our contractors. Yes, that helps us meet our benchmarks, but that's not necessarily best case scenario for them. So that's something to really think about as you're implementing your programs or procedures, is that it can extend far outside the reach of your own agency and your own contractors.
Yeah, and in closing, I would really reiterate the key of partnerships, especially for those training and placement components, and that ultimately, if your agency really embraces the spirit and goals of Section 3, which, as Michaela said, is to try to help those tenants who need support to gain better situations for themselves, then some of the more technical details sort of go away, because you're not just trying to meet compliance, you're actually trying to get some outcomes. I believe that HUD is really trying to get there as well. So thank you again. Please feel free to email us or send stuff to info@phada.org if you have additional questions. Thank you again to Howard and Michaela for participating in this presentation. And we look forward to seeing everyone in person in September. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, David. Just a reminder that the PowerPoint presentation is already available on Whova. The session recording will be added later today. Please be sure to take the session survey in Whova, and our next sessions begin in 60 minutes at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you so much.